Hey, Holy Girl. Welcome back to Holy Girl Talk, the podcast where we sit together, breathe for a minute, open our Bibles, and actually admit what's going on in our hearts. If you're new here, welcome to the sisterhood. We talk about faith the same way we talk about life, honestly, emotionally, with a little humor, and with so much grace. And if you've been rocking with me for a while, girl, you already know the vibe. This is our space, our quiet corner, our spiritual group chat, the place where you can exhale. Today's episode is a heavy one, not in a depressing way, but in a real way. The kind of episode that meets you in the middle of your questions, your pain, your exhaustion, or your God, what is happening season. Because we're talking about Job, the man whose life fell apart in ways most of us can barely imagine, yet whose faith somehow stayed intact through it all. Job's story is not cute. It's not easy. It's not the kind of testimony you post with an aesthetic Instagram graphic. It is raw, emotional, confusing, and brutally honest, which is exactly why every woman going through a hard season needs to hear it. If you've ever felt like life knocked the wind out of you, if you've ever cried yourself to sleep asking God why, if you've ever walked through a loss you did not see coming, if you've ever felt punished even while trying your best, this episode is going to sit with you, hold your hand, and remind you that you're not crazy, you're not forgotten, and you're not alone. One thing I love about Job is that he shows us what real faith looks like. Not shiny faith, not Instagram faith, not church girl perfection faith, but faith that trembles, faith that cries, faith that questions, faith that doesn't understand but still refuses to walk away from God. Job teaches us that God can handle your honesty, God can handle your confusion, God can handle your why. Faith is not the absence of pain. Faith is choosing to stay connected to God while the pain is still fresh. So today we're going to walk through Job's story the way real women walk through real suffering, slowly, honestly, and with compassion. I want you to feel safe in this episode. I want you to feel understood. I want you to feel held by God's presence the way Job eventually was. So take a deep breath, holy girl, relax your shoulders, unclench your jaw. You don't have to pretend you're okay here. We're going to talk about suffering, confusion, grief, silence, friendship wounds, restoration, and most importantly, a God who never leaves, even when life breaks your heart. All right, let's get into it. Before we even talk about Job's suffering, we need to talk about who Job was before everything fell apart. Because Job's story doesn't start with pain, it starts with purpose, stability, peace, and a relationship with God that was built long before the storm arrived. Job wasn't just some random man who got caught in a tragedy. Scripture describes him as upright, generous, honorable, deeply devoted, and spiritually mature. He prayed, he lived with integrity, he protected his family, he made wise choices, and he genuinely cared about pleasing God. Job is the reminder that you can be doing everything right and still experience seasons that feel unfair, confusing, or overwhelming. A lot of women think hardship means they messed up somewhere, that they're being punished, that God must be disappointed in them. But Job's life destroys that narrative. He wasn't careless. He wasn't sinful. He wasn't living wild. He was faithful, consistently. And yet the storm still came. His story is the holy proof that suffering is not a sign of God withdrawing. It's often a sign of God trusting you with a season that will stretch you, deepen you, refine you, and reveal who you really are without the comfort of everything going right. Job lived in stability, but his stability didn't make him shallow. It made him grounded. He wasn't worshiping God because life was easy. He was worshiping God because God was worthy. And that's important because some people only cling to God when things go wrong, but Job clung to God before anything happened. His devotion didn't start in crisis, it started in consistency. That's why his story hits so hard. He had no warning, no buildup, no red flags. One day he was thriving, the next day his entire life shifted in ways he couldn't comprehend. And holy girl, let's be real. Some of us know this feeling too well. You're going about your life, doing the best you can, showing up, loving people, praying, tithing, working hard, building your future, and then suddenly out of nowhere, life hits you with something that doesn't match your effort or your faithfulness. And the first question you ask is, what did I do wrong? But Job shows us that sometimes the storm isn't punishment, it's spiritual stretching, it's preparation. It's God trusting that your roots are deep enough to withstand what's coming. Job's character before the storm teaches us something profound. Faithfulness doesn't stop storms, but it strengthens you for them. His integrity didn't exempt him, it equipped him. His devotion didn't shield him from trials, it shaped the way he walked through them. And maybe that's where you are right now, in a season that feels heavy, confusing, or completely unearned. Maybe you're fighting the temptation to blame yourself. Maybe you're wondering why God allowed something so hard when you've been trying your best. But Job's story whispers this truth to your spirit. God saw something in Job that Job didn't see in himself: a strength, a depth, a capacity, a faith that could survive what others would crumble under. And Holy Girl, he sees the same thing in you. Before the storm comes, God already knows you have what it takes to come out of it. Wiser, deeper, stronger, and more spiritually anchored than you were before. Job's beginning isn't glamorous, it's grounded. And that grounding becomes the foundation for everything that follows. So if you're entering this episode feeling worn, confused, or wondering if you somehow caused the season you're in, let Job remind you sometimes the hardest seasons come to the best people, not because they deserve the pain, but because they are strong enough to survive it and sacred enough for God to use it. After grounding ourselves in who Job was before everything collapsed, we step into one of the most jarring turns in all of Scripture, the moment the bottom falls out of his life. And girl, the way it happens is brutal because there is no buildup, no warning signs, no gentle transition. One moment, Job is stable, blessed, surrounded by family, wealth, and health. And the next moment, everything shatters. Messengers come to him back to back like emotional punches he can't brace himself for, telling him his wealth is gone, his animals are gone, his servants are gone, and worst of all, his children are gone. It is a level of grief and shock that makes your chest tighten just reading about it. Job doesn't lose things over time, he loses everything in a single day. And isn't that how suffering often feels in real life? It rarely enters politely. It doesn't knock, it doesn't schedule itself, it blindsides you. One phone call changes your entire world. One message breaks your heart. One decision someone else makes affects you forever. One doctor's report shifts your future. One betrayal rearranges everything you believed. One moment you think you know where your life is heading, and the next you're staring at a reality you never prepared for. Job's story captures that moment, that how is this my life right now? Disbelief that leaves you numb, gasping for breath, or too overwhelmed to even cry yet. What makes this section of Job's story so relatable is not just the magnitude of his losses, but the speed of them. When pain comes too fast, your brain doesn't have time to process. You feel like you're standing outside your own life, watching it collapse in slow motion while you're frozen, unable to catch any of the pieces. This is where some women begin to question their identity, their purpose, or their relationship with God, not because they lack faith, but because devastation hits harder when you weren't doing anything wrong to cause it. And here's the powerful part: Job reacts with raw humanity. He tears his robe, he shaves his head, he falls to the ground, he grieves, he doesn't hold it together, he doesn't pretend to be fine, he doesn't quote scripture over his pain to hide it, he doesn't fake strength. Job lets the weight of reality crush him because suffering that deep deserves an honest response. And Holy Girl, that's permission for every woman listening. You don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to smile through trauma. You don't have to hold yourself together for everyone else. You can fall apart in God's presence and still be faithful. Job losing everything shows us something that breaks religious stereotypes. Grief does not mean you've lost your faith, it means you're human. Crying doesn't make you weak. Questioning doesn't make you sinful. Feeling overwhelmed doesn't mean God is disappointed in you. Pain isn't proof that your prayers aren't working. Sometimes life just hits hard, and faith looks like falling to the ground with tears in your eyes and saying, God, I don't understand, but I'm still here. This is the part of Job's story that sits with every woman who's ever held her chest, because the hurt was too heavy to speak. Every woman who's ever lost something she thought she couldn't live without. Every woman who's ever stood in the rubble of a life she built and thought, I never imagined this for myself. Job reminds us that God sees your collapse. He sees your shaking hands. He sees the tears you hold in while you're trying to function. He sees the hours you lay awake wondering if things will ever make sense again. Job's suffering didn't come because he failed. It came because life can be cruel, unpredictable, and deeply confusing. And the fact that he fell to the ground shows us that even the strongest believers crumble sometimes. But crumbling is not the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of honesty, the beginning of rebuilding, the beginning of seeing God in a way you never have before. As we move deeper into Job's story, something profoundly human begins to unfold. He doesn't try to be the strong, unbothered, spiritually perfect believer. Job does something far more courageous. He's honest. Brutally, beautifully, painfully honest with God. He cries, he questions, he mourns, he asks why. He admits he doesn't understand. He lets his emotions spill out without polishing them or packaging them to sound holy. And girl, this is where Job's story starts speaking directly to the parts of us we keep quiet. Because we live in a world and sometimes a church culture that teaches women to hide their hurt, we've been conditioned to smile through heartbreak, to perform strength, to avoid questions that might make us look less faithful. Some of us were taught that real faith means pretending everything is fine, even when your heart is splitting in two. But Job's story breaks all of that. He teaches us that real faith is not pretending, it's bringing your truth to God without apology. Job doesn't curse God, but he also doesn't hide from him. He sits in the ashes of his life and talks to God from the most fragile place in his soul. And God never rebukes him for it. God never says, "Stop crying, you should be stronger than this." God doesn't call him dramatic. God doesn't shame him for being emotional. If anything, God honors Job's transparency because honesty creates intimacy, and intimacy is the birthplace of real faith. Holy girl, hear this. God is not intimidated by your sadness. He is not offended by your questions. He is not disappointed in your confusion. Asking why God does not disqualify you from your calling. Crying in prayer doesn't make you spiritually weak. Feeling overwhelmed doesn't mean God has abandoned you. The fact that you bring your rawness to God at all is proof of your faith, not a failure of it. Job's honesty shows us that you can love God deeply and still feel devastated. You can worship and still wonder. You can believe and still have days when nothing makes sense. You can trust God and still say, "This hurts more than I can bear." Faith isn't the absence of emotion, it's the decision to anchor your emotions in God instead of walking away from Him. And here's the part that touches every woman who's been holding everything in. Sometimes spiritual maturity isn't about silencing your feelings, it's about surrendering them. Job teaches us that your prayers don't always have to be pretty, they just have to be real. And God meets you in the real, not the polish, not the curated, not the Instagrammable, the real. When Job pours out his questions, he's not doubting God's existence, he's trying to understand God's heart. He's processing grief, pain, trauma, fear, and disappointment in the safest place he knows, God's presence. And maybe that's what you need right now, permission to stop performing strength and start being honest with God again. Job shows us that faith and feelings can coexist. Faith is the hand that holds onto God while your heart trembles. Faith is continuing the conversation even when you don't get the answers you want. Faith is staying near to God while you wrestle with wounds you can't explain. Job didn't hide his hurt, and neither should you. Now, holy girl, this next part of Job's story gets painfully real because it's not just the suffering that hurts, it's what happens after the suffering. Job's friends show up, and at first they do something beautiful. They sit with him in silence for 7 days. They see his pain, they recognize his suffering, and they don't say a word. In that moment, they're doing exactly what real friends should do, offering presents instead of platitudes. But then they open their mouths, and everything goes downhill from there. Job's friends begin doing what so many people in our lives do when they don't understand our pain. They blame him. They start analyzing, intellectualizing, spiritualizing, trying to explain why all this happened, not to comfort him, but to make themselves feel better. They accuse him of having some secret sin. They suggest he must have angered God. They imply that no one suffers this deeply without doing something wrong. Their religious logic is strong, but their compassion is weak. And girl, haven't we all met someone like that? Someone who feels more comfortable diagnosing your pain than sitting in it with you? This section of Job's life speaks directly to every woman who has ever opened up in vulnerability only to be met with judgment, cliches, or opinions instead of comfort. Some people want to explain your suffering from a safe distance because actually sitting with you requires emotional maturity they don't have. Some people mistake complexity for sin. Some people assume that hardship is always evidence of failure. Some people weaponize scripture instead of offering support. And sometimes the people you expect to show up with empathy show up with arrogance instead. Job's friends represent a type of emotional harm that's subtle but deeply wounding, spiritual gaslighting. It's when someone uses spiritual language to invalidate your experience. It's when someone tries to correct you instead of comfort you. It's when someone implies you're responsible for your pain even when you're already hurting. Job's friends weren't evil, they were uncomfortable, and their discomfort made them cruel. They needed Job's suffering to make sense, so they forced explanations that did nothing but deepen his pain. Holy girl, here's the truth. Not every spiritual voice is a wise voice. Not every religious opinion reflects God's heart. Not everyone who quotes scripture carries compassion. Job didn't need a lecture, he needed love. He didn't need analysis, he needed empathy. He didn't need someone questioning his righteousness, he needed someone affirming his humanity. And this is why discernment is so important when you're hurting, because the wrong voices can make a hard season even harder. But here's the beautiful part: God eventually steps in and corrects Job's friends. God literally tells them they misrepresented him, meaning God defended Job, God validated his pain, God affirmed his integrity. God basically says, Job's faith is deeper than yours because it's honest. If that doesn't make you exhale, I don't know what will. This part of Job's story reminds every woman that your pain is not a punishment. Your suffering is not a sign of God's disappointment. Your emotion is not rebellion. Your confusion is not a lack of faith. And anyone who tries to shame you for hurting is not speaking for God. Sometimes God allows people to misunderstand you so you can learn to hear his voice over theirs. Sometimes the judgment of others becomes the catalyst that pushes you into deeper intimacy with God. And sometimes the hurt from people becomes the very thing that teaches you how to choose wiser, safer, more emotionally mature relationships moving forward. Job's friends teach us one massive lesson. You cannot heal in the presence of people who cannot handle your humanity. After chapters and chapters of Job crying, questioning, hurting, wrestling, and trying to make sense of a life that no longer resembles anything he recognizes, something incredible happens. God speaks, not softly in the background, not through someone else, not in riddles, not in silence. God enters Job's chaos directly, appearing in a whirlwind. And girl, that alone is a message. God doesn't wait for your life to calm down before he comes close. He steps right into the storm with you. But here's the part that's so wild, so humbling, so unlike what we expect. God does not answer Job's why. He doesn't explain the suffering. He doesn't justify the pain. He doesn't hand over a neatly packaged explanation tied up with a bow. Instead, God gives Job something far more important: perspective. He takes Job on a journey through creation, the stars, the oceans, the universe, the mysteries of life, the things beyond human understanding, not to belittle him, but to lovingly remind him, you are not alone, you are not unseen, and you don't have to understand everything for me to be in control. And holy girl, that is a word for every woman walking through something that makes no sense, because sometimes God doesn't give us answers, not because he doesn't care, but because his explanation would be too complex for our human hearts to carry. Sometimes the comfort is not in the reason, it's in the reassurance that God is still God even when your world is falling apart. God doesn't say, here's why you suffered. He says, look at me, look at who I am, look at my power, look at my wisdom, look at my sovereignty. If I can hold the universe together, I can hold you. Job had spent so much time staring at his pain that he forgot to look at his provider. And that happens to us too. We become obsessed with figuring out the why. Why did they leave? Why did I lose that job? Why did this relationship fail? Why did my health shift? Why didn't the dream happen yet? Why is God taking so long? But God gently redirects Job's gaze and essentially says, the point is not the explanation, the point is that I never left. This moment shows us that faith is rarely about getting answers. Faith is about learning to trust God in the absence of answers. Sometimes God allows confusion so you can experience clarity through him instead of through circumstances. Sometimes the silence is not abandonment, it's preparation. Sometimes unanswered questions are what pull you closer to God's heart. And Job, after hearing God speak, responds in the most beautiful, vulnerable way. He doesn't say, now I understand. He says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Job 42. Girl, do you feel that? Job is telling God, before this, I knew who you were. But now, after the suffering, after the grief, after the questions, I know you in a deeper way. That is the hidden purpose of some of our hardest seasons. They force us into a level of intimacy with God that comfort never could. Pain introduces you to a side of God you didn't know you needed. Grief reveals his nearness. Confusion exposes his wisdom. Weakness reveals his strength. Silence shows his steadiness. Suffering reveals his sovereignty. When God speaks to Job, he is not explaining the past. He is equipping him for the future. He is shifting Job from why is this happening to who is carrying me through it. He is reminding Job and you that God's presence is more powerful than any explanation. This moment becomes the turning point of Job's entire story, not because his circumstances magically change, but because his perspective does. His spirit shifts, his heart softens, his trust deepens. Job realizes that God was never absent. He was simply working in ways Job couldn't see yet. And holy girl, if you are in a season where you feel like you're praying into the void, where God feels silent, where the answers aren't coming, where you don't know what's happening or why, this part of Job's story is your reminder. God may not explain the storm, but he will always reveal himself in the storm. And sometimes his presence is the answer. As Job's story moves toward its conclusion, something sacred begins to unfold. Not fast, not flashy, not in the dramatic, everything fixed overnight way we often wish for, but in a gentle, sovereign, deeply intentional way. Restoration enters Job's life quietly, like dawn breaking after a long night. And girl, the most important thing to understand is this: Job's restoration doesn't begin with things, it begins with healing. Before God gives Job back anything material, something shifts inside of him. His perspective clears. His relationship with God deepens. His spirit steadies. His heart softens. His trust strengthens. Restoration begins internally, not externally. And that's how it works for us too. Healing is not God handing you replacements. It's God rebuilding your inner world so you can receive well, walk well, and steward well. What comes next? When God restores Job's life, it is not a reward for surviving, it is the manifestation of God's character. God never intended Job's suffering to be his ending. Job's story shows us that God is a redeemer by nature. He takes what was broken and makes it whole in a way that carries wisdom, depth, and spiritual authority. When God restores, he doesn't just bring you back to where you were. He brings you back stronger, deeper, wiser, and more aligned than before. Scripture says God gave Job twice as much as he had before. But the physical restoration isn't the point. The spiritual restoration is. Because what good is more if you're still broken? What good is blessing if your identity is shattered? What good is increase if your heart is still in pieces? God rebuilds Job from the inside out, reminding us that real restoration is not about what you get back, but who you become. Some of the most powerful restoration moments in Job's story are subtle. It's the moment he can breathe again, the moment his relationship with God feels intimate instead of distant, the moment his grief begins to lift, the moment he can pray for his friends despite their hurtful words, the moment he realizes his suffering didn't destroy him, it transformed him. That's restoration. Restoration is the return of hope, the return of clarity, the return of identity. The return of joy you thought you'd never feel again. And girl, God does restore materially too. He gives Job back community, family, stability, security, and abundance. But notice something important: God doesn't replace Job's children, he gives him new ones, which teaches us that restoration doesn't always mean God gives you the same thing back. Sometimes he gives you something new, something different, something that holds meaning because of the pain you endured, not in spite of it. Job emerges from his suffering with a strength he didn't have before. Not the strength of someone who's never struggled, but the strength of someone who survived something deep and discovered God in the darkness. That is a different kind of strength, a quiet, steady, unshakable strength that doesn't depend on circumstances. A strength rooted in knowing God intimately, not theoretically, a strength built in the painful places. Job's restoration is a testimony for every woman who's ever felt like she'll never be the same after what she's been through. The truth is, you won't be. You'll be better, not because the pain wasn't real, but because God is real, because He heals deeply, because He rebuilds fully, because He renews tenderly, because He restores purpose, identity, and wholeness in ways that suffering could never erase. Restoration doesn't deny the pain, it transforms it. Restoration doesn't erase the past, it reframes it. Restoration doesn't skip what broke you, it redeems it. And holy girl, Job's story is a promise. If God restored Job after unimaginable loss, God can restore you after anything. Your story is not over. Your restoration has already begun, even if you can't feel it yet. Job's story isn't just an ancient narrative, it is a mirror for every woman who has endured a season she didn't ask for, didn't understand, and didn't feel strong enough to survive. When we look at Job through a modern lens, we see our own heartbreaks, our own unanswered prayers, our own confusing chapters, our own losses, and the moments where we whispered, God, why is this happening? Job teaches us something we don't always want to admit. Faith does not prevent pain, but it does preserve you through it. One of the most important lessons from Job is that suffering does not disqualify your spirituality. You can love God and still experience anxiety. You can trust God and still have days where you feel numb. You can pray and still face disappointment. You can worship and still ask questions. Job shows us that faith is not about being unshaken, it's about holding on to God even while your whole world is shaking. Your breakdown doesn't cancel your belief. Your grief doesn't erase your righteousness. Your confusion doesn't ruin your calling. Job also teaches us that you are allowed to be honest when life hurts. You don't have to perform strength to be spiritual. You don't have to pretend your heart isn't breaking. You don't have to hide your tears to prove you trust God. True faith makes room for real emotion. It makes room for trembling prayers, messy journal entries, nights where you cry into your pillow, and mornings where all you can say is, Lord, help me. Job's honesty is your permission slip to be fully human while still pursuing God. Another powerful lesson is about the voices you allow in your life. Job's friends remind us that not everyone is equipped to walk with you through pain. Some people spiritualize what they should be soothing. Some people criticize what they should be comforting. Some people talk when they should listen. Job teaches you to evaluate who has earned the right to speak into your suffering. Surround yourself with people who pray for you, not people who judge you. People who sit with you, not people who blame you. People who hold space for your humanity, not people who demand your perfection. Then comes the hardest but most beautiful lesson. You may never get all the answers, but you will always get God. Sometimes closure isn't intellectual, it's relational. God doesn't always explain the purpose of the storm, but He reveals His presence within it, and that's often enough. Peace doesn't come from understanding everything. It comes from remembering that God is still sovereign, still good, still present, and still writing your story, even when you're in a chapter you hate. Finally, Job's restoration teaches us that the end of your story will not look like the middle of your pain. God is not done with your life. He is not done with your healing. He is not done with your purpose. The season that broke you is not the season that defines you. There is life after loss. There is joy after heaviness. There is clarity after confusion. There is strength after weakness. There is beauty after ashes. God does not waste suffering. He transforms it, repurposes it, and uses it to build a woman with depth, empathy, resilience, and spiritual authority. Job shows us that survival is not passive, it is holy, it is sacred, it is spiritual. And if you're still here, still breathing, still listening to this episode, still seeking God even when it hurts, that means restoration is already in motion. You may not see it yet, but God is working beneath the surface, aligning things you can't see, strengthening you in ways you don't feel yet, and preparing you for a future that will make sense one day. Your suffering is not the end of your story. It's the soil where God is planting something new. All right, holy girl, take a deep breath with me. Job's story is not easy to sit with. It's heavy, it's raw, it's emotional, and it touches places in us we don't always name out loud. The disappointments we've buried, the questions we were afraid to ask, the heartbreaks we tried to survive quietly, and the seasons where God felt silent even though we were begging for answers. So if you're leaving this episode feeling tender, that's okay. That's holy. That means God touched something real in you today. What I want you to remember more than anything is this: your suffering is not a sign that God has abandoned you. Job's story shows us that God is nearest in the storm, clearest in the silence, and strongest in the places where you feel the weakest. You are not being punished. You are not forgotten. You are not overlooked. God is working in ways your eyes cannot see yet, and He's holding pieces of your story that will make sense when the time is right. And listen, if this episode met you in a deeply personal way, if it gave you language for feelings you couldn't articulate, if it made you feel less alone in your confusion or grief, I want you to take a moment today and share this episode with someone who might be hurting too. Your share might be the exact comfort another woman has been praying for. And make sure you're following the podcast so you never miss an episode, especially if you're walking through something heavy right now. We're building a little sisterhood here, and I want you in the room every week. If you ever need prayer, if you want to share a testimony, or if there's a topic that's been sitting on your heart, you can always reach out to me at holygirltalkpodcast@gmail.com. I read your messages, I pray over them, and I carry you in love. Girl, keep going. Keep holding on to God with whatever strength you have left. Keep showing up, even if you show up with shaking hands. Keep believing that restoration is coming, because it is. God sees every tear, He feels every ache, and He promises that none of it, not a single moment, will go to waste. I love you deeply, holy girl, and I'll see you in the next episode.